particular screen, you can see a simple description of how an organization can be aligned with management groups. So let's say Tailwind Traders is the company, which is where the root management group comes into play. Within this company, you have multiple departments. Each department will be its own resource group, management group. And within each department, you can have multiple different sections. So, like said earlier, management groups help you mimic your organization structure. And if you remember, I've told you management groups can be nested. What cannot be nested, guys? You tell me. Management groups can be nested. What cannot be nested? What was the point which we discussed before we went for the break? Resource group. That's the right answer, Hemant. Resource groups can't be nested. Thanks, Babita. You're right too. Then we have talked about subscription. Hey, subscription is always been about billing. Subscription defines your resource consumption, right? Subscription helps you govern access to your resources or services. Subscription or associated with your account through which your resource usage is reported. So these are the points. As an enterprise, these are the 5 steps which you would perform, which we have already discussed. And we've also talked about the term landing zone. So what is a landing zone? It's basically a group of subscriptions that are working together to go with the declarative approach to deploy a complete environment for an enterprise. So if you see here, it will deploy an environment for identity. See here, this is a separate environment. It will deploy an environment for your monitoring. It will deploy an environment for your networking. It will deploy an environment called landing zone, which is for your application, which is for your workloads. It will also deploy an environment called sandbox. So all this in just a symbol of a click. For example, if I launch this KB article here, landing zone KB article, where was it? I think I've closed it. Let me just type it again. Azure landing zone. Is the one. If you see here, you will see a button that says deploy to Azure. So when you use this button deploy to Azure, what it's going to do? It's going to use your blueprints behind the screen and deploy an environment for you with all these groups automatically. See here? So this is the approach that it will take. Coming back to the whiteboard. This is what we have covered. Now let's talk about different types of subscriptions that you have. So we have a free subscription, which is where this link comes into play. Hey, you go here, subscribe yourself, exploring Azure. What you get is a $200 credit for the first 30 days and limited access to unlimited resources for 12 months. So these are the things which you get, right? Pay-as-you-go model. After the 12 months, your free subscription is automatically converted into a pay-as-you-go model. What does pay-as-you-go model do? Billing you every month for the resources that you have utilized. So you just have to pay for it, right? CSP, which is where your cloud solution providers comes into play. Like SIs in India, we have TCS, Infosys, HCL, all these companies, Accenture, all these are your SIs, right? These guys can deploy and manage your environment for you. They can design in certain situations as well, right? So that's CSP license. Enterprise agreement is like upfront monetary commitment between an enterprise and Azure. So this is also another option. Student subscription is where you get $100 credit for 1 year to explore different service offerings from Azure. You must validate your student access, which means you have to submit your student ID pass. So these are things which we have. These are the different types of subscriptions which we have. Any questions, guys? Everybody good so far? Just give me a thumbs up if you're following me. Thanks, Bhavita. Thanks, Roshan. Thank you, others. Is there a minimum monthly charge? No. It completely depends on the resources. Whatever resources that you have deployed, how much you have consumed is what. For more information, how much you're going to end up paying, you have to look into the cost management section of your portal. You can create your budgets, you can configure policies, and you can limit your deployments. That can be done. Now, let's go forward. Can I have multiple subscriptions? The answer is yes. No. Free is for 12 months, but the $200 credit is for 30 days. Okay, welcome. So can I have multiple subscriptions? Yes, we discussed that, right? If I have multiple departments, HR, marketing, finance, and if these departments wants to deploy their resources individually and manage the resources, we can do that. Another example could be to separate environments. I have production environment, I have test and development environment. So I want to have my resources physically isolated. Then go with multiple different subscriptions. It could also be simple isolation. Hey, I want to isolate my workloads. Go with different subscriptions. So whenever we are going with subscriptions, people will ask you, hey, do you want to go with shared subscription model or do you want to go with dedicated subscription model? What do you mean by shared? I'll have one subscription, all the departments in the organization will share that subscription. The isolation of resources will be logical, which means they rely on resource groups. What do you mean by dedicated? Each department will have its own subscription. So if I scroll up and if I ask you the question, hey, what do you call this? Is this a shared subscription model or is this a dedicated subscription model? What is your answer from this diagram? Dedicated. Manoj says dedicated. How about others? I have 20 people in the room. Come on, people, give me some responses. If you look at this diagram, what would you call it? Is this diagram representing a shared subscription model or is it showing a dedicated subscription model? Now understand the definition. Shared means your subscriptions are being shared across multiple departments in a single organization. Dedicated means each department is managing their own resources with their own subscription. The resources are isolated from one another because every time you try to deploy a resource, the first question it will ask is a subscription. So I have mixed answers here. I have dedicated and I have shared. I think the term shared is coming into play only because of these two. So I will say it's both. Because of this. Dev test is dedicated, right? Yes, development and testing environment having their own subscription is dedicated. See here. So HR department has its own. IT department has its own subscriptions. Marketing department has its own subscription. So if you look at the circuits, it's dedicated. I think that the reason why you guys gave me a shade answer is because of these two subscriptions. Everybody following me so far? Just give me a thumbs up. Bringing subscriptions under the tenant directly allows all subscriptions to be shared across multiple departments. Okay, I think because of this box, the answer shade came into play. But if I remove these two subscriptions on the top right corner, then it becomes a dedicated model. Remember that, right? In this scenario, it's both dedicated and shared. Why shared? Because we have few subscriptions under the root management group itself, which might allow all the other departments to access that. Okay, so that's the reason. So the answer both. Whoever says dedicated, the answer is right. Whoever says shared, considering the fact of this particular box, I'm defining, I'm going to give you a point. Okay. So coming back, if you want to have a shared subscription model, it looks something like this. You have a tailwind trader, which is your organization that will be defined by a management group. That organization has a single subscription, and another single subscription, you have multiple resource groups. Each resource group is helping you to keep your resources isolated logically. Remember, we said a resource group is just a logical container which hosts all the resources which share a common life cycle. This is how it looks like. A dedicated subscription model is what I've shown you earlier. Each department will have its own dedicated subscription. So on this screen, we're talking about resource groups. What are resource groups? Resource groups cannot be nested. Resource groups can't be edited once created. Resource group hosts your resources. Resource groups can be created by type, location, project, or by application. So let me pause here and let me ask you this. How have you guys been creating resource group in your environment? Do you guys create it by project, or do you guys create it by location, or do you guys create it by application? What's your method? Let me know that, and then we go forward. How are you guys creating your resource groups? Production and location makes sense. That's one way of doing it. By location and by team, yeah, which is what we have discussed. It could be by location, which means APAC versus Americas, or within India, if I consider it as a geographical location. South India is one region, Central India is another region. South India represented by a city called Chennai, Central India represented by a city named Pune, right? Yep, makes sense. Based on type of resources like data related, wonderful. That's another way, by tech, which means all the databases sits in one resource group. All networking and security components sit in another resource group. So if you see here, there is no one right answer. That's what I'm trying to highlight here. The answer is always, it depends. So all you have to do as an architect is understand the requirements and then map it, which one suits best. So check out the screen, check out the chat box. We have everything covered. We have by location, we have by type, we have by workload, and then we have by project. Then we have tags. What are tags? Tags are like stickers. A simplest way that I can define tags is when we look into what do you call it? A supermarket. When you walk into a supermarket, every object that you touch has a barcode. Can somebody tell me what is the purpose of that barcode? Let's say you pick up a packet of Cheetos, right, or Lay's. It has a barcode on it. What's the purpose of that barcode? Object identity, wonderful, that's correct. More, unique identification, yes. Metadata, wonderful. All those answers are right. So basically, it's giving you information about that particular resource, that particular object, right? It tells you how much it's going to cost you. And then behind the screen, it also helps me manage my inventory, how much I'm selling, how much I'm not selling, which one is the fastest selling item in my inventory, right? Things like that. So basically, if I want to bring that concept to the resources that I'm deploying in the cloud, tags come into play. Tags are like stickers, which provides extra information about your resource. That's where the term metadata, data about data, comes into play. The main purpose of bringing tags is to help you with reports, like for example, billing, right? And then make your search efficient. For example, if I want to know all the resources that are associated with a new project, I can just search with the tag new project, and all the resources with that tag will show up. That makes my life easy. Tags are like key value pair or name value pair. For example, I belong to the team called Worldwide Learning. So team is equal to WWL. That's a tag. Cost center is another example, because whenever I go out to a different country to deliver a training, I have to report my expenses, right? How am I going to do that? That's where I'm associated with the cost center. Cost center is equal to 82346. Just an example. Owner is equal to Habib. Tier is equal to web. All these are few examples of tags. And what I want to understand is, how many tags do you see in your environment per object? Let's say, for a simple hypothetical scenario, for a single virtual machine, how many tags do you associate? The max that you can give is 50. From my experience, I've seen on an average of 2 to 6 tags. So my question to you guys is, how many tags do you see per a resource in Azure, in your environment? For example, production is equal to web. Sorry, tier is equal to production. Environment is equal to production. Tier is equal to web. So simple examples like that. So how many tags do you see? Location is equal to India. 5 to 6 on an average is what Manoj says. How about others? There is no hardened rule that you must have only these many tags. Okay, this, I don't know, somebody would have asked me a question on multi-tenant management, which was also raised this morning. If you have multiple different tenants and if you want to bring all the authentication to a single page, that's where your lighthouse comes into play. So that should be the answer for that. And then decision guides. Tags can be IT aligned or business aligned. What do you mean by business aligned? Business is always for C-class people. CTO, CIO, CFO, all these guys are C-class people, senior directors, managers, right? They only worry about the money factor. Whereas when I'm an IT guy, I worry about the security factor, right? So tags can be IT aligned or business aligned. Few examples. IT application is equal to catalog, search. Tier is equal to web. Environment is equal to production. Environment is equal to staging, right? Classifications is equal to, hey, SLA 24 hours. Purpose is again for business, which is, what is the purpose? What is the revenue impact? What is the business impact? Things like this. Wonderful. Lincoln says they use tags for power operations, right? App service is a web application. So if you see here, those are the different tags that he has highlighted, Vijay, right? Wonderful, Vijay. Thank you so much. So if you see, it's more than 6. It depends, but on an average, you will see approximately 5 to 6 at the minimum. That's what I've seen from my experience. Like we have seen in Vijay's screenshot, they are highlighting platform, which is where Windows versus Linux comes into picture. They are highlighting region. They are highlighting security domain that they belong to, tenant that they belong to, application ID. So you see, there are so many tags. So thank you so much for the screenshot. That would definitely help the new learners here in this particular room. Thanks, Vijay. Now let's go forward. So that was about tags. Why did we talk about tags? So when you're isolating your resources logically, which means when you're going with a shared subscription model where you have a single subscription and all your resources are being distributed across multiple departments by the subscription, I told you that resources can be isolated in these scenarios through resource groups. How do I make sure that my resource sit in that particular resource group? How do I make sure that my resource is tagged? That's where policies comes into play. Azure policies. So Azure policies is a set of rules which help to govern your resources. It helps you enforce business standards in order to maintain regulatory compliance. For example, PCI, HIPAA, DSS, FedRAMP, all these are industry standard regulatory compliance thing which you need to meet, right? It's a service which can be implemented in order to enforce the location or enforce a tag, or if you want to configure a backup policy for all your resources that you're deploying automatically. All these are few examples where Azure policies can come into play. Let me just quickly show it to you how it really works so that you can look into the components as well, right? So if I want to create a policy to limit my deployment to a particular location, first step I'll go to home, search for policy, then click on policy, then I'll go to definition. What are definitions? Policy definitions are those set of rules with which you're enforcing your restrictions. So the term definition, which means defines the rules of your policy. Simple. See here, I have a custom policy called allowed location AZ-104. So let me just delete this policy definition and let me recreate with 305 name. So as of now, I don't have any custom, which means all these policies are available to me by default. If I refresh, that's gone. We have policy. I'm going to definitions. So there is nothing new. So if I want to create a new policy, I have two options. One, I can write my own Java code to define that policy, or two, I can use an existing policy and then I can duplicate it. For example, because we are talking about location, there's already a policy for location. So you go here, allow locations. I'm just going to say duplicate this, duplicate definition. What name do you want to give? I'm going to give 51673, which is your course ID, 51673. Come on. Why isn't it typing? Is my keyboard connected? Yes. So basically it's saying, where do you want to apply? Basically, in other words, this is a scope. So I want to define it at the tenant root group, which means anybody and everybody under that group will be implemented with this policy. Always remember, organization level policies, we always apply at the top level. So tenant root group, name, I'm saying allowed locations hyphen 51673. And then I'm saying, hey, use existing policy. Like I said, all policies are defined in JavaScript. So this is your policy definition. I'll just say save. The moment I save it, what will happen? Under policy definitions, I will see a new custom policy. So if I go back to definitions here, make it all. We will see a custom policy now with the term AZ3, allowed locations hyphen 51673. Let's look for that. So step one to play around with Azure policy is to create your policy definition. While creating the policy definition, you can define the scope where you're going to apply this policy to. See here, I have something called tenant root group custom. This is where I've defined this policy. This is where I've defined the scope. Second step is to go for assignments. The easy way to do that is click on the policy definition, click on assign. So it's asking where do you want to assign it, tenant root group. Is this what you want to go with? Yes. Do you want to exclude anybody from that particular management group? No, I'm not doing that. What do you want the name to be? I say go with the same name, 51673. Do you want the policy to be disabled or enabled? I want it to be enabled. This is the administrator who's applying this policy. Under advanced, if I want to define any resource selectors, for example, hey, add this policy to the members only if they meet a particular rule. So if you want to define those rules, you would define it here. If you want to override anything, you would define it here. I'm not doing that. So I click next. And then here we're talking about parameters, like, hey, which location do you want to allow? So in this situation, I would say, hey, allow only East US. That's the only location. Remediation. Hey, what should I do for the objects which are already there, which are not implemented by this policy? Keep in mind, when you create a policy, the policy is applied only for the new objects. The old objects you have to remediate. And this is where the remediation chapter comes into picture. See here, we'll only detect on the newly created resources. For the old ones, you have to migrate them. for the policy to be more compliant. Non-compliance message, this is not allowed. I'm just typing it. But here in this scenario, an enterprise will have a big standard corporate template message deployed. Click next, create. So what I've created, forget about this because this registration thing came because of my personal subscription details. Okay. Policy assignment succeeded. So how do I test it? Go to home. Go to virtual machines, for example. Go to create Azure virtual machine. Go with the defaults here. Okay. And then go with the defaults. Test VM098. Okay. Rather than East US, I'm purposefully selecting West US. Okay, I'm going with the defaults here. Nothing fancy. Let's go review and create. I'm all the way I'm going with the defaults. Networking, it says something is required or missing. Let's check that, what it is asking. New, okay. Nothing. So you just want us to review. Running final validation. Now keep in mind, as per the policy, the allowed location must be East US. See here, validation file. Check here for details. The resource, your VM09891 was disallowed by policy. Allowed locations, you are not compliant. This is the reason which I gave. How do I fix this? The easy fix is, we know the reason. The reason is because we are not selecting the right location. So if I just go back and select East to West, and if I go review and create, this time the validation will pass. So this is a simple example for Azure policy. Like this, I can create an Azure policy for any object that is missing a tag, so that a tag is automatically added. I can create a policy which limits the size of the virtual machine to a particular size. Within Azure, we have different sizes of virtual machines: B series, D series, F series, N series, H series. Within the series, we have different versions. So you can limit to that extent. You can enable backups. You can define locations. All that can be enforced through policies. Just give me a thumbs up if you're following me so far. So that was a quick demo on policies, how you can use policies to demonstrate by restricting the deployment of resources to a particular location. Everybody good? Just give me a thumbs up if you're following me, guys. Thanks, Astro. Thanks, Vijay. Thanks, everybody. How to get started? First step is either to create or duplicate a policy definition. Why? Because policy definitions are always written in Java, right? So that's what we have seen. Then star indicates only if needed. If needed, you can create policy initiative, also known as policy set. What do you mean with policy set? Combining multiple policies together. For example, rather than just limiting it to location, I want to change the size, limit the size of the reservation. I can define multiple policies together. That's what policy initiative stands for. We haven't created that, but if you needed it, you can create it. Step 3, assign it. How did we assign? Click on the policy definition, click on the button assign, confirm the scope, give a non-compliant message, and then assign. Fourth step, check compliance. Where do I go to check compliance? Hey, if you go, remember, we have already created the policy definition, but we haven't migrated all the policies. So this is where I will go to compliance. All the resources to East region. So wherever you have deployed a resource which is not within the same location, like East US, you will get a non-compliant message. So this is what we are talking about. So under compliance, you can quickly get what resources are non-compliant. So you click on the non-compliant message, and then it clearly says, why is it non-compliant? See here, West US. Moving the resources to East US will make the environment compliant. This is how you check the compliance. I'm just going to pause here for 20 seconds. Try to digest the information that you have on screen and let me know if you have any questions. What we have discussed so far is what are the design principles? Consider what is Microsoft's Cloud Adoption Framework. Then we have talked about a basic definition for cloud. Then we have talked about how do you get started with the cloud deployments. This is where we said, hey, one of the most important topics is governance. Governance is about three things: policies, tags, and RBAC. The next topic that we have here is RBAC. We'll quickly cover that, talk a little bit on blueprints, and then we will cover the tech before we go for our lunch break. Everybody good so far? Just give me a thumbs up, people, if you're following me. Thanks, Vijay. Is there a duplicate policy check? Example, I'm creating a policy, but it already exists, and will I get a prompt? No, we don't have that. We can have duplicate policies. You can't have a name to be same. That's it. But the conditions can be duplicated. We do not have agreement as of now wherein you can find if the policy definition conditions are same. No, we don't have that. Okay. So now let's get going. So the last but one is about RBAC. Now keep in mind the term RBAC means Azure resources, management of Azure resources. Role-based access control defines what actions that one can perform. But keep in mind, in Azure, RBAC is available to you at two different places. One, at Azure Active Directory level. Two, at Azure resources level. Let me show it to you practically. So if I go home, if I go Azure Active Directory, here, Fidelity is the name for my Azure Active Directory. I have roles and administrators. And then I have roles. The super role is global administrator. So this is the guy who can do anything and everything with regards to your Azure Active Directory. Now, what if I want to do user administration? I have something called user administrator. Yeah, user administrator. So this is limited to Azure Active Directory. But what if I want to manage a resource? For example, a resource like virtual machine. If I go to the virtual machine, there is a section called IAM, and then there is a section called roles. So what I'm trying to highlight here is, in Azure, when you're talking about RBAC, the first question that you must ask is, hey, are we referring to an Azure resource or are we referring to an Azure Active Directory? Because both are different. Both roles are different. Places where you can configure are different. For Azure Active Directory, you go home, Azure Active Directory roles and administrator. For Azure resource, you go home, search for the resource, click on the resource, IAM, and then click on roles. Everybody clear with the first basic difference between this green box and the blue box? Green box represents your Azure Active Directory. Blue box represents your resource IAM, resource itself. Give me a thumbs up if you're following me. Thanks, Pratik. Pratik, sorry. Yeah. So what I'm trying to highlight here is, we have roles like owner, contributor, reader when it comes to Azure resources. What do you mean by owner? Owner is somebody who has full access to all the resources, virtual machines, storage account, templates, anything and everything, all the resources, right? Delegate access to others, which means he can invite others, and he can make others as owner. So that's your owner. What about contributor? Contributor is somebody who can manage all the aspects of all Azure resources, but he cannot delegate privileges to others, which means he cannot invite others and make them owners. Reader can only view, cannot modify anything. User access administrator is the one who manages user access to Azure resources, but not the Azure resource itself. So these are the different roles which are available to you with RBAC. RBAC is a term generally representing your infrastructure resource permissions. We have RBAC for Azure Active Directory, but we don't call it as RBAC. We just call it as roles and administrators. Can I allow an Azure Active Directory person to manage all my resources? Yep, you can do that. That's where we have something called elevated access. To do this, you go to your Azure Active Directory, properties section, access management for Azure resources. Just turn this box to yes. When you do this, they have access to manage your resources as well. When I say they, Azure Active Directory user accounts can now manage your resources as well. I'm going to pause here for 30 quick seconds, and then this is where we're talking about, hey, how do you define permission? A permission can be a user, can be a group, can be an application, or can be a managed identity, right? Associated with a role, and define a scope. A role can be owner, contributor, leader. Scope can be management group, subscription, resource group, or a resource. I'm going to bring everything in one page. I know it's going to be small for viewing, but this is just to let you know that all these configurable options are available. I'll pause here for 20 seconds. Check out the screen. Let me know if you have any questions. Like I said, governance in Azure is all about two things: RBAC and policies, along with tags. Tags to recognize your objects, to filter your objects. All good, people? Give me a thumbs up if you're following me. Let me know if you have any questions. Yeah, I can zoom in. So the first thing which we discussed was roles in Azure Active Directory are for two objects primarily: your Azure Active Directory and your Azure resource itself. Resource can be a virtual machine. Then we have discussed, hey, in Azure resource roles, we have owner, contributor, reader, user access administrator. And then with respect to Azure Active Directory roles, we have talked about global administrator versus user administrator. Can I allow an Active Directory person to manage my Azure resources? Yep, provided you offer that access management for Azure resources by going to the properties section, access management, saying yes. And then the last point which we discussed is how you define it. The term RBAC is all about permissions, where you bring user or a group, map it to a role for a given scope. Scope can be only 4 levels: management group, subscription, resource groups, resources. What actions can one perform? That's where the role definitions come into play. Yes, we are going to talk about managed identity, system versus user, going forward when we talk about applications. Now, the term managed identity comes into play when you don't want to worry about the management of identity, but you need an identity for a resource A to access resource B. For example, resource A is a virtual machine. Resource B can be a key vault, can be a database, or can be a storage account. When one resource in Azure wants to communicate with another resource in Azure, they need an identity information to be published. But if you don't want to manage that headache of managing identities for your application, that's where managed identities come into play. Hope that answers your query, Vijay. We will talk about system versus user-based managed identity on day 3. So the diagram, I know where it is coming from. The diagram here, it says user or a group or a service principal or a managed identity. Yeah. So that can be your security principal. Thank you. So now let's talk about the last thing, which is infrastructure as a code. Why would one want to go with infrastructure as a code? The answer is simple: repeatability and consistency. Which means I want to deploy a resource in a repeated fashion, but with less errors. This is where the declarative approach, which means using the template, comes into play. If you have worked on Kubernetes, you would create those YAML files to deploy your resources, right? To bring on your deployments. Deployment is the term generally referring to an application package completely. So the ARM templates, which are in JSON format, are used by your Azure blueprints in order to deploy your resource. So if Manish is a developer who wants to build a particular application, the first thing he would say is, hey, I have a piece of code, I want to test it. In order to test it, he needs resource. If he wants a resource, he has to contact IT team. So we can remove this complete hassle through automation. So this is where we said, hey, Azure blueprints come really, really handy. So Azure blueprints bring 3 things together: your RBAC, your policy definition, and your templates. This is where we're going to stop our lecture. That's our module number 1. Model number 2 for compute, we will talk about it once we come back from the lunch break. So I'm just going to pause here. If you have any questions at any given point of time, just unmute your line, speak up, or drop them in the chat box. I am monitoring your chat box as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly run you through the deck, which gives you a quick overview of what's really happening with governance in Azure. And if there are any important points, we will discuss that. If not, once done with this deck, we will break for lunch. So in this lesson, we were expected to learn about what is governance, what are management groups, what are Azure subscription, what are Azure resources, how tagging works, bringing governance through policies and RBAC, and what Azure blueprints are. We have covered almost every aspect of this. Let's just quickly go through it and then proceed forward. Governance, like I said earlier, governance has always been about maintaining control over the resources that you deploy. Control, right? Typically, we can implement governance at 4 levels, which is what we have discussed: management groups, subscription resource groups, and resources. What are management groups? Management groups are logical folders to host multiple subscriptions. And then keep the management group hierarchy reasonably flat, because the max depth that we support is 6. Consider top level management group any organizational level policies that you want to implement. You can mimic your organizational structure. This is where we are talking about departments coming into play. Right? Consider a geographical structure, which means Americas versus India. Consider a sandbox management group, which means for isolated resources who doesn't want to get connected to the internet. Consider isolating sensitive information in separate management groups. For example, I need the finance data to be isolated from HR or IT. What are Azure subscriptions? Subscriptions are logical containers for management and billing purpose. We've already discussed this. Align your subscriptions with your business needs. Consider billing and cost reporting. Consider administrative management centralized or decentralized. Group subscriptions together under management groups. Apply common policies and role assignments. Consider subscription scale limits, especially for workflows like IoT. Consider a dedicated shared service subscription, common services everyone shares. And then make sure subscription owners are aware of their roles and responsibilities. All these are some good points about your subs. So this one here is a dedicated subscription model. Each layer has its own subscription to manage. This way, they can manage and track cost of individual organizations with ease, and then we can identify different environments such as development, test, and production, which can be often isolated from a management perspective. Resource groups are logical containers that hold related resources for an Azure subscription. The example which we saw for resource group is by type, which is this one here, by type, and this one here is by application, because I have the load balancer, I have the network, I have the SQL database, I have the virtual machine, different resources, all within a single resource group. You can use resource logs to protect individual resources from deletion or change. For example, I take your attention back to my portal, home, storage accounts, MHS0302. This is under a resource group called mod 4014. So I'm just going home, resource groups, mod 4014, and search with the keyword log. And then I'll click on add log, log name, test 51, what is the class number? 51673. I'm saying this is a read-only lock or delete lock, read-only, which means no modification should be allowed. Okay, now if I go back home, storage accounts, MHS0302, configuration, I have to scroll down. I have multiple options, right? I just say disable block public access. I'm just disabling this. Click save. See here, update to failed storage account. Because of the following scopes are locked. Do you see this message? Capture that message. Yeah. It clearly says, hey, because of the resource lock, I can't make changes to what you've asked me to perform. So how do I override this? All you have to do is go back here. So go back to home. Go back to resource groups. Go back to MHS 4104. Go back to logs. So here, just delete this log. Or I can change it to delete log. Just 51673. Now in delete log, the condition here is you can modify the settings, but you can't delete the resource. Which means if I go back to home, if I go back to storage accounts, if I go back to MHS 302, and then if I go back to configuration again, I'm doing the same thing, what I did last time. If I just say no public access allowed, click save. See here, this time the save will work. So the point to remember with resource locks is the behavior will change. We saw two types of locks, read-only lock, delete-only lock. When you go with read-only lock, what's happening? You cannot modify. Delete on, sorry, you cannot modify. Modify the resource settings. Nor can you delete. Delete-only lock. You can review the settings. You can review or change the settings of a resource, but cannot delete it. Everybody just give me a thumbs up if you're following me. We did this check practically. Resource locks. Now let's get going. Resource tagging, we've already seen. Tagging generally helps you identify the particular resource object. It can be used for billing purposes or it could be used for filtering purposes. Policies are now back together. We have discussed this. Policies make things happening. Policies help you maintain compliance of your environment. Policies help you limit the reverse emission size, enforce a tag, configure it with the location base, and enable audit and login for your SQL applications. All this can be done with Azure policies. You can also enable multi-factor authentication for all your subscription accounts. What are the conditions that I must consider for Azure policy? Apply policy at the highest scope level. If you remember, any org level policies must be applied at the top level. You must know when policies are evaluated. Now, keep in mind, policies always come next. The first one is RBAC, because the first thing that will be validated is whether you can log in or not. The portal.azure.com. Second, whether you have permission to deploy the resource or not. So, in simple terms, when policies are evaluated, your RBAC comes first, followed by policy. And then use the Azure Policy Compliance Dashboard for auditing and for reviewing existing policies, which we already have checked. Effectively combine your Azure policies with RBAC. What is RBAC? Role-based access control. Define only the permissions which are required for the role to perform an action. So we have looked into this. As you can see on this diagram, RBAC comes first before Azure policy can be triggered. If it doesn't have permissions, then it doesn't make sense for a person to go with Azure policies. RBAC and Azure policies are must. I'm just going to pause here for 10 seconds, check out the diagram, and let me know if you have any questions, guys. Ready? Want you to bring in a no votes. Everybody good so far? Just give me a thumbs up if you're following me. Always remember, RBAC comes first before your policy. Then finally, we have talked about blueprints. Blueprints let you deploy your resource in a repeatable and consistent fashion. Blueprint, bring your ARM templates, resource groups, RBAC, and policy definitions together. That's module number 1. Time right now is 11:44. Any questions? We have one case study for governance and one case study for compute. We will do the case studies post lunch like we have discussed. So any questions here, guys? Any questions? Everybody good so far? Can we move resources across resource group if they have delete or read only log? Okay, that's a very good question. If there are logs, can you move? No, cannot. Again, you cannot move a resource group from one resource to another resource group. I mean, you have to basically move it. I mean, let me show it to you practically. So let's just say home resource groups, which is 014, and then there's a storage account, right? There is a storage account. And let's say I want to move this resource. Move from the subscription. So if you see here, it's asking you, do you have another subscription? Do you have other resource group? I only have these two resource groups. I can't change the subscription, so I have to go back, select the resource again one more time. Is an east to west. Here, which region I want to go to? East to west to west to west. I can change the location and then it will work. Windows will lock it. lock already exists. Delete lock is available, test 51634. Now let me just try migrating it. I'll just create test resource group first. I've created a resource group 51673. I want to move the resource storage account from that resource group to this resource group where there's a lock available. It's completing the validation, just bear with me. It should fail. With the delete lock on it, you can't move it. Okay, while this is going to take about a minute or two, any other questions, guys? It will fail. I'm going to show it to you in some time, but apart from that, any other questions? If no questions, it's been preview from long time, Manoj. I have no clue about it, whether they're going to make it GA. Who's going to bring up the timer? Scan the QR code, be back here by 1 p.m. Singapore time.